It's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Villeminot. Hi, Flo. A big year for elections here in France, 2017. Of course, in the spring, we saw the presidential election. There was the legislative election. But believe it or not, this fall, there's another election in France for the Senate.
It's a drumroll, the senatorial elections. Now, keep in mind that French senators are elected for 6-year terms, but every 3 years, elections take place to renew about half of the seats in the chamber. There are 348 red velvet seats in the Senate. Now, it's a very important ritual in democracy, these senatorial elections, but you'd be forgiven for not knowing about them. In fact, a lot of French people themselves are quite oblivious to these senatorial elections because most French people don't vote in these senatorial elections. It's actually the one election that's very similar to what happens in the United States, the electoral college system. French senators are elected by other elected officials. They're called les grands électeurs, the big voters, I guess you could say. There are about 162,000 of these grands électeurs. Essentially, they're regional and departmental councillors, mayors, and also members of the lower house of parliament. So unlike the president and the members of the lower house of parliament, the Assemblée nationale, they are elected directly by universal suffrage. Senators are elected indirectly.
So as you say, Flo, the parliament is divided into an upper house and a lower house. In France, we often hear about this lower house, the National Assembly, or Assemblée nationale, as you said, which is in charge of voting laws. We've talked about it here on French Connections. What exactly does the Senate do?
Well, cynics say not that much. In fact, critics call the Senate the retirement home of French politics. Others call it Sleeping Beauty's castle because, indeed, the Senate is located in quite a luxurious place, the Palais de Luxembourg, right near the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. Now, traditionally, the Senate has been the domain of conservative, elderly men, if you will, and they're elected for 6 years, which is quite long compared to other elected officials. Critics say they just sit around their gold-leafed palace, not doing much. But, of course, senators beg to differ. Let's take a listen.
What shocks people is the gilded decorations. It's true, we work in a splendid palace.
We do a really good job. The problem is that we have this reputation of being an assembly of misogynist grandpas. It's not completely wrong, but it's stuck to us.
People who call the Senate the Republic's retirement home are wrong. It's not fair because we work really hard.
Okay, so they apparently they work very hard. What do they do exactly?
Well, the Senate represents something called les collectivités locales, sometimes called les collectivités territoriales. It's a word du jour. I must admit, when I hear this word, my eyes glaze over and I kind of stop listening. It sounds really boring, but it's very important in France. Essentially, it's a network of power that's spread across the country. It's decentralized authorities at the local and regional level. Those are the collectivités locales, and their interests are defended by the Senate.
So representing these local collectivities may be the Senate's #1 mission, but what else do they do?
Well, let's take a look. On top of representing these local authorities, they have several other missions, an important legislative mission, because the Senate actually votes laws that come from the government or the lower house of parliament. It has 7 committees to examine these laws, these treaties, etc. And the Senate itself can also introduce bills. You can see another mission is to keep the government in check, to make sure the government's doing what it said it would do. And you can see this role here as well. It has a constitutional role. Only hand in hand with the lower house of parliament can it change the constitution, but when the Senate and the Assemblée nationale get together, they can amend the constitution.
So politics, of course, all about power. How much power does the Senate have compared to the lower house of parliament?
Well, in many ways, the Senate has a lot less power than the Assemblée nationale because even though the Senate tries to influence wording in legislation, the Assemblée nationale always has the final word when it comes to laws. That being said, though, the Senate has other powers. It's the guarantor of French institutions, and so unlike the lower house of parliament, the upper house of parliament can never be dissolved. And on top of that, if the president of the republic dies or is taken ill or goes on vacation, well, it's the president of the Senate who takes charge.
Now, just like for other lawmakers, the amount of money senators are paid is a very controversial subject. Many critics say too much. How much is it exactly?
Well, their base salary is exactly the same as the members of the lower house of parliament. Let's take a look. They get just under 7,210 euros a month. So this is before tax. And on top of that basic income, they're given an allowance for parliamentary expenses like rent, petrol, transport, etc. And on top of that, they get a stipend to pay their staff. You can see it, all the figures here. It adds up to about 21,000 euros at their disposal each month. And on top of that, they get a lot of other perks as well. For instance, French senators can travel for free in first class on the SNCF railway network across the country, and they get most of their phone bills reimbursed as well.
Now, the French Senate has its critics on the left and on the right, and some have gone so far as to actually call for the Senate chamber to be removed entirely.
Indeed, because critics say, look, these senators, they're old, they're out of touch with the population, and they're paid too much. And on top of that, they're redundant. These critics say, look, we already have a lower house of parliament. Why do we need an upper house as well? Perhaps France should follow in Sweden's footsteps and just get rid of the upper house altogether. But as you can imagine, senators say this two-house system is very important.
This back-and-forth system between the two houses guarantees that laws are of good quality.
This might not please my colleagues in the lower house, but often we improve their texts.
There are no insults and no cursing in the Senate, only a respectful exchange of ideas.
We have time to think. We don't put on a circus-like show that you can see from our colleagues in the lower house.
So the debate over whether the Senate is a safeguard of democracy or a decrepit drain on public money rages on, but I must admit, I kind of want to be a senator when I grow up.
I do too. It actually sounds kind of fun. All right. Thank you so much, Florence Villeminot, for that very interesting look at the Senate here in France and this French Connections. Don't forget, if you want to ask Flo any question about anything that happens here in France or in regard to the French, you can always do that. Just to send her a tweet at Flo Villeminot.